So those of you that are regular, you'll be able to see that the format sticks to what we're used to, so we get all of that information. I have evolved a little bit over the past couple of years as series and pandemics have forced us. But we're going to start by looking at some entry data across the examination boards and other awarding organisations. And then I like to take a bit of a dive into the data of those crossover questions that we find at the end of the foundation tier and the start of the higher tier. Then I like to have a look at the start of those foundation papers, the first 5, we like to call them, those kind of 1-mark questions. I know as a teacher that when I said to my students, here's your papers, we're going to start away, and if they started to lose marks on that first page or so, I knew I wasn't in for a good ride for the rest of the marking. So I like to have a look at how students are starting their papers now. I'm going to have a look at the winners, and some of you know I don't like to call them losers, but the topics that need a little bit of a focus, or those that we may have expected to have gone well, but not, that they didn't for whatever reason that may be. So kind of the winners and the in progress topics we'll look at from across the foundation tier and the higher tier. And then some keynotes, just in case you haven't had a chance to read through all of the examiner reports. I've tried to summarise them into 2 slides for you, both for the higher tier and the foundation tier. And then we'll have a look at the grade boundaries. Of course, we were returning to pre-pandemic standards. And so I have the grade boundaries and the grade awarding proportions that we'll look at just very quickly between this year and 2019. And then everything you need to know for how we can support you as we go into the November series in a few weeks' time, but obviously as you're going along this academic year. So let's have a look at the entry data. So you will see that we had just under 500,000 students sit their GCSE maths with us this summer. An even split, really, still looking at 50-50 if you like, so 53.4 of those percent of those students were sitting the foundation tier, and then 46.6% of the higher tier. That's for us, that's our entry data. AQA had just under 200,000, OCR just over 60,000, Educas having about 14,500, and CCA you can see 23,000 entries. There were 787,000 entries across England, and of course across all of the UK, 822 if you take into account the Welsh board. So you can see we're still strong market leaders and still the exam board of choice for GCSE maths. Let's have a look at the crossover analysis then. So this is data heavy, and I've tried to get the data in as big as I can across your screen, but I appreciate that some of this, this is the smallest you'll see. I've made everything else a bit bigger, so just bear with me for the first couple of slides. But these are those crossover questions. So for paper 1, there were 26 marks available. And we usually find that there's around 75 to 77 marks available as crossover across the whole of the 3 papers. So 26 marks of the crossover questions that went from question 20 to 28 on the foundation, and then 1 to 9 on the higher. So it started with applying those 4 operations. We can see that that was not very successful, question 20. I think I've picked that one out for you. Only 24% success rate on the foundation tier, and I believe it was that mixed fractions question. So we're always seeing a kind of lower performance on the foundation tier for mixed fractions against 69% for the higher tier students. So my pink bar is the percentage outcome for that question. So as you scour down the foundation tier, we see a stark 10% there. There's 10% success rate on question 22, and that was areas of triangles, parallelograms and trapezium. So obviously we don't have the time for me to pick out all of the questions that I would love to talk to you about today, but do take some time afterwards to have a look at some of these questions if you're interested in what that question actually looked like. We did see that question 3 on the higher tier, it wasn't well answered, particularly well kind of that early on the paper, but definitely a lot better than 10% on the foundation tier. So they're the mean performance figures in pink. And then I like to pick out the performance for our grade 5 and grade 4 students on these crossover questions. They're the ones that we tend to enter for, right? So when you are as a teacher or a head of department and you're making those tiering decisions, it's really crucial to enter them at the right tier, whether you've got a grade 4 that you want to kind of take that risk and put them in for the higher paper, as well as the grade 5. So it's interesting to have a look. It was really clear that the tiering decisions were really accurate, and students were entered for the perfect tier of choice. But what I wanted to pick out was a couple of instances where grade 4 students on the foundation tier kind of just picked their counterparts. Now, of course, the equating algorithm means that students should come out with similar scores, whether or not they sat the foundation tier or the higher tier. So they're very, very insignificant nuances between the two. But it's nice to see that when you see a strong grade 4 candidate on the foundation tier versus the higher tier. So have a look at this paper 1. We can see that, for example, those applying those 4 operations, that fraction question I spoke about earlier, we can see that the average score, it was a 3-mark question, but on the foundation paper, the average mark for a grade 4 student there was 1.18, and the average mark for a grade 4 student on the higher tier was 1.45, so slightly higher. I'll let you have a dig into this data as you have your own time, maybe over the weekend with a cup of tea or something. But the stronger paper of the 3, and I'll talk about this again a bit later on, but paper 1 was really a really good strong start for those foundation tier students overall. If we have a look at paper 2, there were 25 marks available across the crossover questions, and you can feel that strength dissipate here. You can see that the higher tier students were stronger. Paper 2 wasn't it didn't have that strong start or that strong finish for the foundation tier students, but still some of them pipping their counterparts only minimally. You can see here question 25, a real tricky ratio in context question, but our foundation tier students at grade 5 were getting around 2.79 on average out of 3 marks versus 2.75 out of the 3 marks on the higher tier. So again, this should reassure you that a grade 5 student, foundation tier or higher tier, they perform similarly, they score similarly, which is reassuring because of that equating algorithm. So crossover questions on paper 3, there were the 26 marks. So across this paper, we're seeing 77 marks in total for crossover questions, and we can see that the foundation tier students had a stronger finish on paper 3 than they did on paper 2. We can definitely see there's excellent outcomes for their percentages. There was a percentage change question towards the end that wasn't, it was okay. I mean, there were 4 marks. We've got grade 5 was 3.76 and 3.46 kind of average marks, but I will pick up some of those percentage change problems that we saw through the marking. And I had some conversations with some of our chief examiners that told me what they found in percentage change. Laws of indices, I would have expected, maybe I'm being greedy here, but I would have expected a little bit of a higher outcome for my higher tier. Should be knowing our laws of indices to get started on a higher tier, and I'm going to talk about those a bit more later. The good thing about doing this sort of analysis is I can look at the trends from historic performance as well, and there will be times today where I'll show you whether or not our students are getting better and stronger, more confident in particular topics, or actually there are a couple of occasions where we are not developing our strengths, but I have some reasons for that. Prime factors and multiples was a really good question for students. I think it was part B for grade 5 students. I really noticed there was almost a double in yes. So grade 5 students for prime factors and multiples, they scored an average of 0.9 out of the 2 marks available in comparison to 0.45 of their grade 4 counterparts. So real kind of indicative or indicator really of a grade 5 question on that part B. So good to see where questions you can really see the data jumps from one grade to the other when you're having a look through these skills maps. And it really does kind of distinguish where those grade 5 students are, you know, so much stronger than their grade 4s, or you can see that the grade 3 students are not as strong as their grade 4 students. So it's a real good indicator of where those strengths and questions lie. So let's have a deeper dive into some of these questions. Now, I and Seb and Teresa on the call, we don't get to see the live papers. We're not in that team. We get to talk to you guys all the time. So we're not allowed to see live papers. And so just like all of you, we sit on social media or waiting by the phone or waiting by emails to see what the reactions are to the papers as they're being sat. And I remember as a teacher, just, you know, the students will come and find you and say what they thought of the paper and the types of questions. You really just couldn't wait to get your hands on the paper to have a look. Well, we have that same thing here in our team because we don't get to see the papers. We don't get to see them until the same time as you do. However, what we do get to see is social media. And I find it very funny as I'm waiting for reactions from students, and I come across things like this where students are saying, oh, you know, the first thing I saw was this. I mean, I'm quite impressed that they almost got the question right. I mean, they've put 8.49 instead of 8.46. I'm always fascinated when students come out of exams and remember exactly what that question was. But yes, there was some activity on social media around this question, thinking, oh gosh, you know, first one I open and I've got to do a decimal division. How dare they? But in summary, the notes that we picked out from here are, you know, many foundation tier students, they did not know how to approach long division, as we've seen with the average score, the average outcome mark there. There was a 29% success rate, as we saw. There were far too many arithmetic errors, which prevented many of the students getting more than maybe 1 mark in that question. So even when the division was carried out correctly, the accurate placement of the decimal point at the end was where they fell. You know, they weren't able to kind of put that decimal point back in, and many were unable to deal with that remainder of 6, and so we saw a lot of 56.6 as the answers. So I think they're common problems that we know of, but just highlighting for you so you know how to attack those common misconceptions as you go back into the classroom. For higher tier students, like we saw, 69% of students were successful in this question. They used a more formal method to divide 846 by 15, and they usually gained that first mark for making a correct start to the method and getting a 5 as the first digit. So many went on to get all 3 marks. So what I'd like to suggest, you know, throughout this this afternoon, don't forget there are many themed papers on the Emporium. I've put a little picture in the corner there. So if you have got students as you're doing mocks and interventions and things, and you think, okay, that student needs some work on working with decimals, you can go into the foundation tier or the higher tier themed paper cabinet on the Emporium and pull out a paper that's got all of the questions that we've seen so far that they can practice. And there are worked solutions that they can use if it's independent learning, and also there are the mark schemes as well. I can see people are raising their hand. I'm not going to get time at the moment for people to contribute at the moment. It's amazing that we can on this platform now, but I am conscious of time, and so if you do have something to contribute, that would be great if you could pop that in the chat. Let's have a look at question, I think it was question 6. Yes, scatter diagrams. So this is a fond memory of mine with scatter diagrams. I always used to harp on about how important it was for a line of best fit, because I used to tell students there's a hidden mark there. Whenever you look at part B of a scatter diagram question, you will get 1 for the answer, and usually you get 1 for the line of best fit. So I always used to tell students, make sure you've got your line of best fit. Now, actually, there isn't a mark for the line of best fit, but it made sure that the students were drawing their line of best fit properly so that they can read more accurately and that they are within that range of allowance. So as you can imagine, Part A, majority of higher tier students, 85% of them were able to describe that relationship between the age and the weight of babies. Obviously, an answer of positive correlation was fine, but we can't accept positive relationship, and we can't accept just positive. So a nice positive correlation, please. That word correlation is important. The most common error was to directly state the weight was, directly proportional to the age. Part B was answered really well, higher tier, 93% gained all 2 marks of these. Great 93% success rate here, and a large proportion of students gained both marks for getting that answer within the range of 2.5 to 4.5, with many drawing their line of best fit. However, the foundation students are a lot more vague at answering part A. Instead of using the keywords positive correlation, they're saying babies are growing, babies are getting bigger. Apparently, the examiners or the markers were telling me that they had some essays on how the development of babies occurs within 12 months. So really making sure that students can see 1 minute for 1 mark, ideally. I know that's a ballpark figure that a lot of teachers use, and a whole essay there isn't required. In part B, a correct answer was given in the range, will get the marks, although the evidence was a lot less convincing. Very few candidates drew that line of best fit on the foundation tier, and of course, if they had drawn it, it wasn't necessarily in the correct place. So I think a rule coming out of there, or some developmental pieces, is to get students in the foundation tier really practicing with those lines of best fit for scatter diagrams. They are a really frequently asked question across both of them. Both of the tiers, so an important, which is why I picked this one out, really important. Along with the next question, again, one of my favourites, and almost a predictable first question or first couple of questions, is writing a number as a product of its prime factors. We've seen, I say hundreds, that's an exaggeration, but we've seen this time and time again, almost in every series. It's question 2 on paper 2 for the higher, and 21 on the foundation tier. We do obviously know that students can use their factorial button on their calculator, which will tell them. It's the FACT button on the calculator. So if they put in 60 and hit equals and then do the fact, it will give them the answer. Of course, that won't give them both the marks. We want to see the working out. But I picked out one of the questions from the exemplars that we're working on at the moment. I thought I'd show you that this is a higher tier candidate's response, and you can see quite clearly what the problem is here. But as some analysis, the foundation tier students, the most common error here, or the biggest problem we saw, that was students were just putting down the pairs of the factor pairs, which gained no marks. Obviously, they were putting 1 and 60, 2 and 30, 3 and 20, etc. So they got no marks for that. They didn't understand how to get the prime factors or do the tree. Listing the correct prime factors gave them a mark if we saw the comma, but we can't give all of the marks if it's not represented as a product. Surprisingly, if we think about how frequently this type of question is asked, 37% of the foundation tier students scored 0, but about 49–50% scored all of them. I say all, 2 marks. So we are improving. Last year, product to prime factors, the proportion of students that got both marks was 46%. So we are getting better marginally. Last year, 93% of the higher tier students gained all or both marks, and that was 97% this year. Nearly everybody on the higher tier got both marks. However, it was difficult to distinguish some of the way that the students were representing their answer at the end. Very hard to see if it was a multiplication or an addition. So we need to make sure that students are taking care with their presentation. And of course, you can see here, this student has done all the work, got the lovely prime factors, however, has represented it as a sum rather than a product. Okay, question 7. Again, this is becoming a more frequently assessed question. Error intervals. It was brand new to the specification back in 2015, and so a huge shock to the system when we were starting to ask this question at all, let alone on the foundation tier. But it's definitely one that we're getting used to. I love teaching this. I used to have some wonderful ways of teaching this to my foundation students in particular. The majority of them attempted the question, and that is something that we need to celebrate, and we have been celebrating over the past few series, that foundation tier students are becoming more resilient and willing to give questions a try towards the end. I remember there was a time years ago where students would become whether it's tired or demoralized or exhausted by the end. We saw less and less engagement at the end of the paper, and now that's not the case. The students who gained part of those marks were great at finding one value, as you can imagine, usually that 12.65. But obviously we see a lot of the 12.74. It's commonly assessed. Last year we saw a 20% success rate. Sorry, this year was 20% success rate. Last year was 36%. Now that's one of those topics that I think, gosh, I thought we were making some progress last year, but we have to bear in mind that we were given the advanced information. And so maybe there was more progress, more revision, more focus on these types of questions that hasn't had that kind of that fortune, if you like, of the advanced information. However, when we first saw this question in the first year of 2017, there was only 7% success rate. And so we are better, but obviously we've taken a dip from last year. Higher tier students they continue to answer this question really, really well. The average mark for higher tier students was 1.76 out of the 2 marks, with an 88% success rate. That is an improvement. So higher tier students are improving. It was a 77% success rate last year. Compound interest. So I picked this out in the initial overview at the beginning when we were looking at the foundation tier performance. But this is a lovely compound interest where 2 people are buying a house and we're looking at the value as it increases year by year. And this was one of those clear grade 4 indicator questions on both the foundation and the higher tier. The average score for a grade 3 student was around a whole mark difference than the grade 4 student. So for the foundation tier was 1.54 for a grade 3 and 2.49 for a grade 4. So you can see the average mark, the huge difference between the 2 grades there. And then on the higher tier, the average mark for a grade 3 student was 2.02 and 3.06 for a grade 4. So again, a real big 1 mark difference between the performance. So definitely does separate out the grade 3 students and the grade 4. Obviously, really successful at the higher tier with those average scores, as I've just mentioned, a 92% success rate. However, that was only 37% success rate on the foundation tier. Most of those foundation tier students scored at least 1 mark for getting that 4% of the 150,000, or the 1.5% of the 160,000. But there was a lot of common errors using simple interest. Students are reminded to read the questions carefully in those examiner reports. And unfortunately, we did see a problem in the multipliers being used. As you can predict, we were seeing 1.4 and 1.15 as the multipliers, which of course gave them huge numbers when it should have been 1.0, or they could have used the 0.04 and the 0.015 and then added that on themselves. Okay, the other one I picked up as well at the beginning of the session were the laws of indices or index laws. And this was first question, as we saw, on the higher tier, and question 20 on the foundation tier. Real basic skills being tested here. Okay, we're building a little bit at part C. The differences between performance across the tiers, though, was vast. And we are definitely seeing a widening of the gap between the foundation tier students and the higher tier students in these skills. So last year, we had, part A was assessed last year. We saw something like x cubed to the power 5 or something like that. So very similar. And we had a 61% success rate on that question on the foundation tier last year. This year, 43%. Again, that could be down to the advanced information, but we know these are commonly assessed styles of questions. In comparison, the success rate has increased slightly for part B. As you can imagine, it was common to see the 5 and the 8 be multiplied. That's, we see that often. And often we see the M multiplied. We see 2 M's and 3 M's or the 2 X's on part B, for example. So the common errors that we expect, we certainly wouldn't expect such a decrease in those skills. The students at foundation tier, those ones that knew what to do with the product, for example, they knew that they were adding the power, but they then put 2x to the power 13, which, kind of now biting really. They're almost there, but when it's a 1-mark question, we need it to all be there. Now, this next question that I picked out, it had me chuckling because, like I mentioned, we haven't seen the papers. We don't know what's coming. And so we saw a lot of tweets about someone's having a lot of coffee. So I couldn't wait to get hold of the question. I like the penguin one. It says, Johnny in the GCSE paper 3 Ed Excel maths exam bringing 11 kilos of coffee to work. So yeah, great question. That I was anticipating to see. We saw already that there were some percentage calculation problems with the compound interest one that we saw in paper 2. However, this particular question was not only very popular on social media, it was also another great grade 4 indicator. So we saw almost again that grade difference between grade 3 students and grade 4 students. Here it is then. So question 2, Johnny wanted to know how much coffee he would need for 800 people at a meeting. So we saw lots of different calculations that students were trying. There was a lot of common errors, especially on the higher tier. If the student didn't get the correct amount of coffee, it was usually because they were dividing 1088 by 10.6 instead of multiplying to give that final answer of 103. Obviously, students can use calculators for this paper, and quite a big proportion of students use that build-up method. But where candidates didn't show all of their stages of working, they simply just stated incorrect percentage values, and so no further marks could be given because the processes weren't communicated properly. But yes, lots of coffee that Johnny needed for his meeting. And this was the last of the questions that I wanted to pick out for the crossover questions. It's not particularly a favourite question of our foundation students, and I know it certainly wasn't a topic that I really would drill into students. Those were the marks for me where students could get you know, the bonus marks. But this one was one of the bonus marks that I thought, you know, it could be down to a little bit of common sense or just graph reading, and that's the turning point. And the majority of students can see the turning point. So although it's not a commonly asked crossover question, I was really drawn by what I heard from the examiners in their feedbacks. At the foundations here in particular. Now, this was a 50-50 successfully answered question. The foundation students either got it or they didn't. And it literally was 49% of foundation tier students got 0 marks and 51% got the 1 mark. But the interesting point here, and almost painful, the painful note to pick up here, is that they did notice where the turning point was. However, they got their X and Y coordinates around the wrong way. So you think they're identifying something quite challenging for a foundation tier student, but they're not able to get their X and Y coordinates around the right way, which as a teacher, I know if you were marking that paper, you'd be, you know, the pain would be too much. But 91% success rate on that turning point question at the foundation, at the higher tier, sorry. Okay, let's have a look then at the first 5. So are we getting our students off to a really good start to their foundation tier experiences? So we have released, last year we released our 1 mark question papers. So we have put together every single 1 mark question that you find at the beginning of the papers, and they have been put into, I'd like to call them starters. We've called them the 1 mark starters, which is a great kind of 10-minute starter activity where students get to practice those kind of the 1 markers, the commonly asked questions that we expect at the first 5 questions. You can find those on the Emporium. They're PDFs. You can print them out 4 to a page, cut them up, display them on your board for students to do on whiteboards. And we've also got the solutions there as well that you can project onto the board. So let's have a look at the performance of paper 1, the first 5. Now, as we saw on the skills map, the performance grid that we saw earlier, it was a real strong finish to paper 1 for our foundation tier students, lots of greens on those crossover questions. And we can see a really strong start as well on paper 1. So it was the strongest. The first question, not the strongest of all of them, but we tend to see this. And I had a look at the analytics across the years, and they're very, very close. There is very little in performance improvement or decline. So I think this was 88% this year success rate. I think last year it was 87% or 89%, so nothing worth kind of really drilling into. But writing a percentage as a decimal. Question 2, fraction of the shape, they can count the shapes. Let's have a look at some common misconceptions though. I'm sure you can imagine the most common problem for question 1 is 3.8. We saw a lot of those, or 0.38%. They had the percentage still there. So yeah, a lot of students just forgot to put the decimal in or left the percentage sign in there. The question 2, actually, you know, 94% success rate there. We saw the occasional miscounting of the sections, which is always going to happen as human error, I guess, sometimes. Question 3, ordering those to maybe find the smallest. I know some students will be able to see the smallest straight away, but quite a few students failed to read the question carefully and gave that ordered list rather than just answering from the list right down the smallest number. Of course, we can see that was 0.5. Some students wrote 0.50, which of course was absolutely fine. Question 4, -9, add 5. Of course, we saw the most common answer as -4, but as predicted, you can imagine we saw a lot of -14s and 4s, with an 82% success rate there. Question 5, who would have thought that solving a one-step equation would outperform adding some negative numbers or directed numbers. But it was 92% success rate for question 5. Whether people do it as you know, the hide the P, for example, I know a lot of students do that, or they can do the inverse operation. It wasn't uncommon to see -1, but of course we saw 92% get the correct answer. So paper 2, we had rounding, a decimal into a fraction, converting metric measures. Always a problem converting metric measures. You can see there from the statistics on the bottom right hand side, only 67% of students got that question right, and I think it was 67%, 65% last year. So again, nothing significant to drill into, but still a common problem for students. Question 1 was obviously 85% of students getting that right. I'm sure we can predict the common errors there, maybe just rounding, not rounding to the nearest 100, maybe rounding to the nearest 10 or the nearest 1,000, for example. Question 2, another accessible question, again 85% success rate. Let's have a look at question 4. Spoken about question 3. Question 4, the common incorrect responses was to have 70, 82 or 8 squared or 82t from not applying the correct operator. So lots of weird and wonderful things sometimes that students do when they're under pressure at the start of an exam. Here is a list of numbers for question 5, just identifying which one is a multiple of 5, and we saw a 92% success rate there. So paper 3, we've seen the percentage into a decimal, the decimal into a fraction, and now a fraction into a percentage in question 2. So we've kind of covered all of those fractions, decimals and percentages elements there. Writing down a number into digits, the conversion, the simplifying of algebraic expressions. Again, we've got a metric conversion and then ordering negative numbers. You can see that's that dip again. Question 4, metric conversions is not our strong point. So more work, ongoing work with those across the board needed. And question 3 as well, we could see lots of m to the power of 4, as we would anticipate as well. And as you can imagine, we saw a lot of m4s rather than 4m's, which is fine, of course, but we like to see that 4m. Question 5, the question was answered well, 93% success rate. Those that didn't get the mark generally got the -5 and the -2 around the wrong way, and some only wrote down 4 numbers when I was looking through the marking notes. So again, a painful outcome for teachers if they're seeing and using those access to scripts. Okay, so I'm going to pick out some of my favourite questions from the foundation tier. And not just a personal favourite because I enjoyed the question, my favourite because of the way that the students were attacking those questions and the performance outcomes that they arrived at. I always love a recipe question. I was that maths teacher that used to book out the cookery room, and we used to go and do our recipe questions and make biscuits or chocolates at the same time. So if you have that facility in school, I definitely would encourage that activity. Great fun. But this was one of my winners for paper 1 on the foundation tier because it was the strongest question in the second half of the paper. 78% of students scored both the marks available. There was an insignificant progression from last year. It was 76% success last year and 78% this year. But I wanted to pick out this question because it was important to note that so many students were wasting their valuable time by working out all of the ingredients required to make the 60. And you know, that it's 2 marks that rule of thumb, 2 minutes, 2 marks, for example, and students were just getting lost and bogged down in all of it. Most correctly found 3 lots of 250, but some did try to find the amount of flour and then multiplied it by 60 after finding 1. The method would get the credit, but it was rare to see a successful answer because of the division of 250 by 20, for example. And then some students misinterpreted the question and then had assumed that Harry already had 250 grams of flour, and that the question was asking how much more he needed, which we have seen questions posed that way. But again, it's just, I wanted to pick out a couple of the errors that students were making because this is a commonly asked style of question, and we want to ensure that we're passing that message on to students so they don't kind of make the same mistakes as their previous cohorts. So my other question to pick out from the foundation tier that I thought was interesting to talk to you about was question 18 on paper 2. Again, nothing surprising. Ash is buying 180 cans of Coke. They're sold in packs. There's 12 in each pack. Each pack costs £3. Work out the total that she can buy. This was a clear winner, as all students across all grades scored well. So we're talking question 18, and I was so proud to see even our grade 1 students scoring an average of, you know, they were scoring more than a mark. It was really successful for them to get their teeth into, but it was a real good indicator for those grade 2 students and above. They were a clear whole mark away from their grade 1 students. We saw an 89% success rate, again, reminding ourselves that we are question 18 on a foundation tier. So 89% success rate, that compares with a 90% last year. And again, I want to keep reminding us of that advanced information from last year, where yes, students were provided with that, but these students weren't, and they're still holding up. They're still performing strongly. The ability and the resilience, I've already mentioned that. It was second to none, and we should really take pride in students that are really tackling those multi-step questions. I've made a note down here just for reference. Last year's question that was similar was a question 7, and that was on paper 1. So if you want to refer back to, so again, let's take that into context. We're mathematicians, so a 90% success rate at question 7 last year, and an 89% success rate at question 18 this year. That's why it's a winner. Paper 3, I saw the distance time graph. It was particularly successful for all candidates, and I think that's because of the context that it's produced in. Students can relate to it, they understand the context, that they know what's happening, they can visualize what's happening here. Both parts, there's part A and part B. There's a couple of dotty I two-eye dotty question on part A, but the minority did struggle to read the scale. I have taken a snippet out of the skills map here, so you can see the distribution of marks there across the question. So we've got outcomes by grades. We've got our grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 across the top. So you can see the average marks given. In part B, many candidates were able to draw that horizontal line as they were completing their travel graph, and they were also able to draw the line back using a ruler. It's nice to see. But in part C, candidates were using their diagonal line maybe a little bit incorrectly. Some of them were great and were able to arrive at that average speed for part C, sorry. But there was also some students that were able to use the speed distance time formula, and were able to kind of plug in their numbers, but then kind of tripped up at the end when being able to manipulate it or to rearrange that equation. So there were lots of different ways that students were attacking this, but I think still a really good, strong outcome for our foundation tier students. Okay, the ones that I want to pick out in progress then. So we did, as I mentioned in the crossover questions, I've picked out two side by side here. And the reason is we saw a multiplication of fractions at question 15, and then we saw those mixed fractions again at 21, which was of course that question 1 on paper 1 for the higher tier. So again, we know that calculating with fractions, so we're talking about those topics now that need some work, that are in progress, that are not performing as we would hope that they would. It continues to be an area of development. A third of students this for question 15, the multiplication question, it was the performance was kind of split into a third. A third of students scored 0, a third of students scored 1, and a third of students scored 2 marks. The most common correct approach was to find the product of the numerators and a product of the denominators to give 30 over 84. And then, of course, the problem then came from trying to get that into its simplest form. A high proportion of incorrect answers showed an attempt to find equivalent fractions by adding the numerators. Obviously, we did see some students kind of try and cross cancel before. For question 21, I want to pick up again that there was only a 38% success rate here on the foundation tier. We know these types of questions are challenging for our foundation students, but of course, the majority of the students that gained a mark were those students that were able to convert those improper into improper fractions, and the most incomplete answer seen was 39 over 8. However, in many of the solutions, students at all levels, there was obvious arithmetic errors. I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise that many of the students didn't know the answer to 7 times 8. And we were often not seeing 7 times 8 is 56 when they were trying to get their improper fraction. Question 15 on paper 2. Now this, at face value, this question appears to be really straightforward. Here's your dice. Charlie's throwing the dice once and spinning the spinner once. Is he more likely to get a number less than 3 on the dice or a number greater than 5 on the spinner? And so, you know, we would think, okay, this feels like a really nice question that students can get their teeth into. However, it was clear that grade 4 and grade 5 candidates were more skilled at answering this, and posed as another kind of grade 4 indicator. Grade 3 students scored an average of 0.88. Now there were 3 marks available, and then the average mark for a grade 4 student was 1.58. So a real big difference in average score there. Whilst many of the students expressed at least one of the probabilities, very few of them could actually show that one outcome was more likely than the other, and therefore couldn't choose a conclusion or put a conclusion together to support their answer. A lot of students listed all the numbers on the dice and then highlighted the ones that were less than 3, and listed the numbers on the spinner and highlighted those that were more than 5, but they didn't write it as a probability, and so they couldn't gain the marks. Some who did write it as a probability included the 3 and included the 5 from the spinner, suggesting that there was a bit of a misunderstanding when it came to the more than or the greater than and the less than. So there are some key points to pick out on why I've picked that question out, because I think in terms of the skills required, the students below grade 4, the grade 3, 2 and 1 students, they could see the problem. They were writing down their outcomes, but it was writing it down as a probability that caused the problem. I wonder if this next question will shock you as much as it did me. Question 6 on paper 3. Now, you would not think that this type of question could cause such interest. And I get the pain points. I've taught these students before, foundation tier students. I was teaching for 12, 13 years. But we have a grid and I can hear your brains. They're saying, I know what they've done. They'll miscount, they'll double count, they'll forget where they started, and they get it round the wrong way. They do the perimeter instead of the area, and vice versa. But I wanted to pick this out just because of the outcomes that I saw. I knew that there will be a proportion of students that struggle with this for the reasons I've just said, but the outcomes were pretty stark. There definitely needs to be some increased focus from students on practicing this type of work and using the centimetre grids. For part A, finding the area of the shape, 58% of our students scored 0 marks. 58% of students scored 0 marks on part A. And for the perimeter of the shape, that was 62.5% of students scored 0 marks. I think because it was so much more than half the students, it really alarmed me that students were still struggling. A common incorrect answer was 288, where they worked out the length of each side and they've multiplied them all together. So you've got 6 by 2 by 4 by 1 by 2 by 3. So 288 was a really common one to see for part A. Part B, the perimeter caused more issues when candidates, as we can predict, missed some of the sides, double counted some of the sides. They got confused between area and perimeter, and so no marks could be awarded. So it's a really good point. Some of the kind of queries coming in the chat, maybe we just assume that students are good with this. They've been doing it for years, you know. Obviously they learned this way and counting methods in primary school. Do we just presume that they're okay with it? But I'm glad I've picked it out, because it really did kind of bring it home to me that maybe it's definitely something we need to focus on. So who knows, if we get this question, similar question in November, in a few weeks' time, or in the summer, that we can be talking more successfully about a question like this. And the last question I wanted to pick out from the foundation tier. Now, those of you that were in my feedback session last will be like, oh no, she's not going to go on about these again. But I think it's important too. There will be people here listening in today that haven't heard me harp on about this, and I'm sure you're all reading the examiner reports and can remember the feedback we get there. But last year there was a paper, a question on paper 3 again last year, angles in parallel lines, very, very poor outcomes. Again last year. We've seen a slight improvement. 7.7% of students got all 5 marks, which I understand that sits right. About 10% of students will get all 5 marks on this question, bearing in mind they've got to give their reasons, and you know, I can get that. However, 52.9% of students scored 0. So it's kind of decreasing a little bit, because it was 46% last year. So we are kind of getting, the progress has been in reverse, shall we say. It's clear that grade 4 candidates are more successful than grade 3. A huge difference between the 2 grade outcomes there. 2.5 marks on average for a grade 4 student, and just over 1 mark for a grade 3 student. There was an easy 1-step calculation, the angles on a straight line. We can get that from that 110 or the 125. But then some students have spoilt their work and stated the fact that the triangle was isosceles. I'm not sure why they would say that, but you know, again, exam pressure, they're trying to you know, show anything they can get out of their brain. But yeah, we saw a lot of isosceles triangles being used to get the other equating, the 70 from angle D, and then angle C being 70, and then angle A being 40, for example. Very few students were able to state parallel line reasons. We often saw that parallel lines were the same. A little bit of work in their communication there. and the use of correct angle notation. This is the bit that I'm thinking people will recognise as the repeated outcome from examiners and the markers. That angle notation from students is rare. So most candidates, let's note now that candidates are, that they're working nice and sequentially, but they're being spoiled by not using the right notation. So maybe let's encourage students to write on the diagrams, draw on the diagrams. The examiners can see the thinking of the students when they do that. So that's my ongoing tip for angles in parallel lines. So let's have a look at the winners of the higher tier then. As you can imagine, there are some lovely outcomes that we see when we have direct proportion. One of my favourite type of questions when you're teaching this to your higher tier students. The average score for this question was 2.25, and it was a clear indicator at a grade 6. 77% of students scored 2 or 3 marks on this question, which shows that they're really getting to grips with this type of skill. Many of the students who gained the first mark started to do their y equals kx, or plugging in 24 equals 1.5x, and they went on to give that fully correct answer. Quite a few students used a non-algebraic approach, and though they're quite successful, they tend to offer more arithmetic errors because of the lack of accuracy. So it was really good to see the proportion of outcomes for those students this year. We are beginning to become familiar with the quadratic sequences, and it's really pleasing to see that students are being able to gain the marks now. It's becoming a clear grade 7 indicator, as you would probably anticipate, and overall 45% of students on the higher tier got all 3 marks on this question, which is why I've picked it out as one of our winners. This year we've seen students using the formula approach to find the values of A, B and C. It was common for the examiners to award 2 marks for candidates working with n squared and getting as far as the sequence or seeing the sequence n squared plus 3n. And we also saw an increase in candidates working with different variables, normally x, which of course can gain full credit. However, we did see some students using multiple variables, two variables, and as you can imagine, there was some confusion as they were working through the problem and then unable to get the 4 marks in the end. But another great success for one of these familiar assessed questions. Then I picked out the recurring decimals. There were so many good attempts at this question. We're question 20 on the on paper 3, so right near the thick of the end. 63% success rate. That's nearly 2/3 of students, really doing well on this type of question. So it was a great performance statistic at this part of the paper, and even the examiners were very happy to see these outcomes. Most students who understood the method, they used 1000x or 10x or 100x minus x, whichever method they're comfortable at using. The detail and presentation of the proof could be clearer. I know that students tend to kind of go all around the houses of the page when they're trying to work these out, as much as we try and drill in the layout and the clear communication of these. So definitely something to pick up as you're going through this topic again this year. But for full marks, examiners expected to see an indication that the recurring decimals was being used by the use of that ... or by the dots above the 2 and the 3. Students who gave a correct and complete method without that lost that final mark, because obviously they're implying a terminating decimal, for example. So I'm going to look at questions from the higher tier that need some progress. For question 1, I think we can understand why this would need some progress. I I've written down in my notes here that I'd expect this to feel somewhat expected, you know, like I've just said, in terms of algebraic manipulation skills. It's really testing that students can manipulate their expressions. However, it was only the grade 8 and 9 students who saw or demonstrated that fluency in the manipulation. There was a 40% success rate on this question. Grade 6 students scored an average of 1.2 marks, and grade 7 students scored 2.35 marks. So a real over a grade difference between the grade 6 and grade 7. But then when we go to grade 8, 3.6 for grade 8 and grade 9. I combined the score there. So then, you know, they're almost getting full marks in comparison to those grade 6 and grade 7 outcomes. More than half the students who gained that first mark for multiplying both sides by 5x plus 3 went on to get full marks. You know, as soon as a student recognises to kind of clear that denominator out of the way, they know what they're doing and they can manipulate both sides of the equation. Many students, though, did not know how to deal with the fact that the x was on both sides, and how to deal actually with the fact that we had an xy term. So they were the stumbling blocks once you got into the thick of that manipulation. The next question I picked out from paper 2 was the histogram question. Now, we often see ongoing common problems with histogram. It was clear that it's a topic that students continue to find difficult. We had a 36.8% success rate of students gaining all 4 marks on this question, and very few calculations were seen in part A. So students should be encouraged to show their working out. And I know that it's something that you all say all of the time, but you can play this recording to students when it becomes available. I will just mention here that the recording will be available in a week or so, and we're going to keep it under silver padlock on the website. I'm sure Seb and Teresa have been saying that in the chat as we go. We're very conscious not to share the mark schemes and all of the questions out on YouTube, because we try to keep these papers as secure as we can, as much as we try and battle against people that share them widely. But going back to this question, very few calculations were seen. We want to see all those written methods. Values were given in the question, so it's a simple calculation for them to do. But the errors then continued into part B, where we saw very few correct responses. Okay, here we go. Again, I'm sitting at my desk, seeing Twitter and social media start to go a little bit crazy. I start to get messages from bosses and people asking about, you know, have we seen the question? Can I have a look at the question? All of these. I think we know which one's coming, but that was a snippet, by the way, from a newspaper article or an online article that GCSE pupils are fuming over the sadistic last question in the Edexcel maths paper, and claim that it's on an A-level exam website. And a couple of tweets there. Here it is then. I love this question. And we had this, I think the year before, I think it was last year, question 21 with the circles. And I remember being in a maths conference room and asking the maths teachers in the room, like, you know, who thought it was a wonderful question? And you know, all the maths teachers like, oh, it's just amazing. It really did separate out those high attainers. And of course it should. It's question 24 on a higher tier paper. It should really show a grade 9 indicator. So this is this year's question of interest. It obviously is a question that needs progress work, but I think it was a brilliant question. Grade 9 students, their average mark for this question was 3.94 out of the 5 marks. Grade 8 students, their average mark was 2.09. So it really did give those grade 9 students something to get their teeth stuck into. The most common approach was to split the shape into a square and 4 identical triangles. Therefore, you can correctly identify an angle inside or outside of the triangle, and therefore students were able to get the first mark. To get the second and third, they needed the expression for the area of one of them, and then the length of the side of the square. The former was awarded more regularly, as many spotted that the triangles were right angles and isosceles, although there were some fantastic responses, some really excellent responses from students. Some of them were let down by their accuracy in their algebra. And we also saw that candidates were just guessing the value of P, which you can imagine there is a few students that are going to do that by the time they get to the end of the paper. But of course, they guess the value of P, but there was absolutely nothing to go with it. And so they couldn't get any of the credit. And the last question I want to pick out for you in progress, again, as you can imagine, one of these frustum questions, volumes and surface areas of 3D shapes always can cause a problem for some of our students. It's question 18, and I just want to pick up that only 40% of, I say only, 40% of students scored 0 on this. I would have expected that to be less. We've got the curved surface area of the cone formula given. Is there something we can do in terms of practicing this type of question in class? The successful completion depended upon students being able to use the direct proportion between the larger cone and that smaller cone for the frustum. Many students realised it, but there was a significant number who basically just halved. And they used 1.5 in their calculations. It's important that we tell our students that we're, giving them the opportunity to practice these combined skills. I definitely remember a lot of my students used to call them the ice cream questions, when you would have the hemisphere and the cone, kind of those compound 3D shape questions. I've put a picture of our aiming for questions in the top corner of the slide. If you really want to try and stretch those higher retaining students, there are some aiming for grade 7 and aiming for grade 9 practice tests on the Emporium that will allow you to give those students some kind of questions that they really can get their teeth stuck into. So I've been through the examiner reports, and alongside having those conversations with the chairs and the chief examiners after the series and during the marking process, and I've kind of tried to put everything together as a whistle-stop tour, really. Coming out of the foundation tier, there are questions and topics here that I haven't picked up on individual questions today, obviously because we would be here a long time. But the examiner's feedback is to focus more on those estimations, that rounding, and being able to estimate questions. The equation of a straight line, if you look into that question, students are really struggling even to draw lines. Y equals 4, I think, was the question that came out this year, and students really did struggle to do that. Fractions, as we've talked about, and those algebraic expressions in the formula, that manipulation of the simplification of the algebra, even like we saw in those first 5 questions, even at 4m instead of the m to the power 4, for example. That long division that we looked at, especially in terms of the decimal division, and painfully knowing that students can divide the numbers and they know how to do the arithmetic, but then failing to put the decimal point into the correct place. Venn diagrams came up this year as a topic of focus, as well as the reverse percentages, and then using the probability tree diagrams. Now, we know our foundation tier students are successful at completing tree diagrams, but it's reading from them and being able to use them. So to summarise, the examiner said that the early questions were a clear, accessible way into the paper for the foundation tier students, and so many of them are gaining a really good proportion of those marks now. Students are successfully expressing their communication skills, something that we've been working on for a while, I know. And again, we hear that handwriting is still a problem for some students, and it's making those questions, the answer to those questions, difficult to read. Students should have access to a full set of equipment. There were times where the examiners can see that students didn't have a ruler, you know, that, or they didn't have a calculator where they should have access to, and also they need to be reminded that if they write above a question, it means that it might not be seen by the examiners. There's a kind of perimeter or a box around where the papers get scanned, and so trying to remind students to make sure that they're writing within the box around the question is also a note to make. So for the higher tier, again, we looked at set notation last year, but just to pick up that set notation for probability and the Venn diagram work as well. Algebraic manipulation, which we've seen that in the index laws, and we've seen that in the reordering of or the rearranging of that expression. Simplifying surds, I know we definitely looked at some questions last year. Again, that does tie in with the index laws as well, making sure that students know how to apply or to convert their surds into their fractional or negative indices. Vectors needs some focus, as well as that inverse proportion, and algebraic proof, of course, will a feature on our list of a to-do list, if you like, at the higher tier. But it was important to pick up specifically on the higher tier that the examiners are saying that students really need to consider the reasonability of their answer at the end. Does it seem right? Is it suitable? Just make sure that students are really checking. Does that feel like it's around there, that estimation element? There was evidence of students miscopying down their figures. So from the question down to their working out space, they're making an error in their figures, or then misreading the numbers in their questions. That could just be exam pressure, human error, but just a point to note to students as well. Trial and improvement, there was lots of, even when we're solving equations or solving problems, there's lots of just students trialing it. I'm going to try this number and see if it works. So, you know, it really does buy into students' valuable time as they're working through the paper. So kind of discouraging that is a rule of thumb, really. And then candidates just being really clear in their working and their structuring, as we would be saying to them all the time anyway. So let's have a look at grade boundaries. So like we said earlier, there has been a return to pre-pandemic grading this summer. There were kind of protection. There was a big statement that came out from, it was on Ofqual's website, and they published that. We put it on our grade boundary document as well, that's on the Emporium, that there had to have been that protection in place, and allowances made where the quality of student work is weaker than before the pandemic, and therefore it means that a student that would have, you know, a typical student who would have achieved a grade 5, for example, before the pandemic, will just as likely be able to achieve that grade 5 in 2023, and so, you know, we're just aligning those outcomes. So I put both sets of grade boundaries here. I know that a lot of teachers were expecting the grade boundaries to increase a little bit because of you know, the preparation, the ability of students. I think from everyone I've kind of spoken to, were, I say, happy, you know, that the grade boundaries felt in the right position. We can see, for example, here a grade 4 was 52 marks before the pandemic and 47 marks after the pandemic. It just shows that we, at the higher tier I'm talking about here, just shows that our grade 4 students are not as strong as they were beforehand, only slightly, a few marks down, but it meant that the proportions could align nicely, so that it was applied, you know, that the proportion outcome was applied from before and after to return to that pre-pandemic standards. Similarly for the foundation tier across the 3 papers, of course, 149 in June 2019 and 147, so not even a mark per paper, and again at grade 5, and of course I'm sure you've done your own analysis there. So our grade boundaries remain consistent, no huge changes, nice accessibility as we've heard from the examiners and that we've seen from the students as well. We're seeing a consistent performance from our grade 4 students. Looking down the performance themselves, grade 4 students are now really confident at accessing, you know, over 65% of our papers, which is a really good position for those students to be in. And I think it gives teachers that confidence as well when their students are going into the exams. They know what the outcomes are going to be, and they feel confident in the boundaries and the performance outcomes. So that consistency, of course, means that all of that accessibility work that we did back in 2017, 2018 is really, it's still there, it's consistent, the contents are applicable for students, the language is available. We often hear students and teachers as well talk about wordy questions or less words or more words, and it's important to remind students that sometimes a few more words might help you access that question. So not necessarily that less words means more accessible. You know, it could be shaping the question and the context a bit better. So it's really good to see that consistent outcome now, and the boundaries are nice and settled since the very beginning of this qualification. So these are the grade proportions as well. So you can see that alignment, we have seen just an increase in grade 4s that were awarded from 2019 to 2023 across the board. Slight differences, as you can see, across the tiers, but you know, our grade 5s in the foundation tier, they're more now. We're getting stronger at that grade 5 and seeing more students come out stronger there. So a really nice outcome to see from 2019 and 2023 as we're coming out of that pandemic. So in the last 10 minutes, I'll try not to go too quickly, but all of the support that we have, I'm sure the majority of you are signed up and have your free access to the Maths Emporium. If you haven't, this pack, the downloadable PDF pack, all of the links are embedded. So you can click on those links and it will take you straight there. When you're applying for a Maths Emporium account, please use your centre number and your centre email address, just so we can check that they cross-reference, and we can check the Edexcel online account, and then you have your access. There's a picture there and a whole list, and I could go on for even longer, but there is just such a treasure trove of free resources in there, practice sets, mock sets. The mock papers, you will see mock sets up to 6 on the Emporium, 7 and 8 are on the website, and they are under padlock to keep them nice and secure. Mock set 9 will be out in January, and that means we'll move one of those papers onto the Emporium. But if you want the latest one, just use your Edexcel online account and go onto the GCSE Maths website under the mock paper tab. There are crossover question papers, and all of this is coming out for the 2023 series. So we will have our shadow papers are just on the website, the Emporium now. There's an Emporium email coming out on Monday that will tell you everything that's out so far. So if you are working on those crossover questions with your students and just want papers of those questions, they're in there, as well as everything else that I've spoke about today, and all the exemplars that we're working on at the moment. They will be out in the next few weeks as well. If you are a teacher of post 16, I will be doing another session, a feedback session, on the 19th of October, and I'm just going to look at the data and the performance for those key topics that post 16 teachers say are crucial to the grade 4. So there are no no Pythagoras, no vectors, you know, those core topics that teachers told us, these are the ones I focus on the most. We have an on-screen diagnostic assessment that you can use with your students now. They can do their tests in under an hour. They're multiple choice and will allow you to just diagnose what intervention you need to put in place instantly. You can access that on this poster. There's a link at the top of this screen here that takes you to all of these resources. A new scheme of work, themed papers. Now we've taken the exam questions and made them more FE friendly. So that could be catering style questions, hair and beauty style questions, sports studies, for example. So it could be the difference to hook those students in to practice GCSE questions. We've also got some lesson plans, again, applying some further educational context, and also the summer feedback for post 16 is free again. If you want to come along and listen to me, again, just looking at those 28 key topics, then please do click on that register now link, and it will take you there. We're only going to do an hour. It's not all of the intricacies across the 2 tiers or those first 5, etc. It's going to be looking at how are students doing on solving equations, the fractions, the percentages, all of those questions that I'll pick out across the papers. We've also got delivering a GCSE maths course for the first time programme as free CPD over the next year. This we had in mind that there are newly qualified teachers, there are non-specialist teachers that you may have in your department. Please do guide them to these webinars. We've broken them down into 5 sessions. You can book them individually, don't have to attend all 5. So it's really there designed to support you and your colleagues on whether or they need help on some new resources or applying mark schemes, for examples, and how to prepare their students for exams, for example. They may not have done that before. And there's more. We've got posters, the lessons, there is a support PDF, we have a YouTube channel where you can see all of our previous training networks on there. And as I said, MockSet 8 was released in January. That will go over to MockSet 9 this January coming. And the last thing I will mention is, just in case you need something to listen to on the way in or on the way out of work, we've got our incredible podcast where you can listen to me or to Mark or to Teresa, who's sat with us this afternoon, talking to teachers, other people across the sector that have insights into all sorts of wacky and wonderful. We've got the one with the incredible Matt Parker, who's a comedian, mathematician. So lots of interesting themes that have come out of those podcasts. Carol Vorderman's daughter, Katie King, she talks about her time as a GCSE science teacher, and there are teachers as well, Pearson Silver Award teachers, that have done the podcast too. So I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you. Thank you for those of you that have made it all the way through an hour and a half. I try and keep it so we can finish right on time.